I'm Michael Carter, 34, a former Army sergeant who served 3 tours overseas. For years, my family called my military service a waste of potential, said I should have gone to college, gotten a real job, built something meaningful. My brother Jake, the golden child with his finance degree, would smirk whenever Mom praised his practical choices. My sister Emma would roll her eyes when I mentioned my benefits, calling them government handouts. Even Dad, who claimed to be proud, would always add, "But imagine what you could have accomplished in the real world." Then the housing market exploded, and suddenly my family's perfect plans crumbled. Jake's credit was shot from risky investments. Emma's startup failed spectacularly. Mom and Dad faced foreclosure on their dream home. That's when they remembered my useless VA home loan benefit, the one thing that could save them all. But they had no idea what I'd learned about loyalty during my years in service, and they were about to discover that some lessons can only be taught the hard way. If you've ever felt undervalued by those who should love you most, you'll understand. What happened next? Jake's diploma hung in the living room like a trophy, its expensive mahogany frame catching the afternoon light. Business administration from State University, summa cum laude, complete with golden seals and ribbons. Mom had insisted on the professional matting, the perfect placement above the mantel where every visitor would see it first thing. My Purple Heart sat in a shoebox in my bedroom closet. Remember when Jake graduated? Mom would say to anyone who'd listen, her voice swelling with pride. With top of his class, job offers from 3 different firms. Starting salary higher than most people make after years of experience. She'd pause, glancing at me with that look one that said she wondered where she'd gone wrong with her other son. Jake had always been the golden child. Even as kids, his report cards went on the refrigerator while mine got a cursory glance and a try harder next time. His soccer trophies lined the shelves. My wrestling medals stayed in a drawer. When he got into college, they threw him a party. When I enlisted, they asked if I was sure I didn't want to think about it more. The irony wasn't lost on me now. Jake, the financial genius, the one who was supposed to have it all figured out, was drowning in debt from his own poor decisions. His investment portfolio, once his pride and joy, had crashed spectacularly. Cryptocurrency gambles, tech startup investments, leveraged real estate deals, all the smart money moves that were supposed to make him rich had instead left him broke and desperate. But somehow, even in his failure, he remained the favored son. Dad would shake his head and say, "Jake just took some risks. That's what entrepreneurs do." Meanwhile, my steady government job, my VA benefits, my careful financial planning, these were signs of playing it safe, of lacking ambition. I remembered the last family barbecue before everything fell apart. Jake had pulled up in his leased BMW, designer clothes, expensive watch glinting in the sun. He'd spent the afternoon talking about his latest opportunity, some tech startup that was going to revolutionize social media. Dad hung on every word, asking thoughtful questions, nodding approvingly. When I'd mentioned my promotion to senior analyst at the Veterans Administration, the conversation had shifted quickly. "That's nice, honey," Mom had said, already turning back to Jake's story about meeting with venture capitalists. Emma had rolled her eyes when I'd talked about my VA home loan benefit. "More government handouts," she'd muttered, not bothering to lower her voice. Jake had laughed, not meanly, but with that casual dismissiveness that somehow hurt more than outright cruelty. Now Jake's BMW was gone, repossessed along with most of his other toys. The venture capitalists had taken his money and run. The tech startup had folded within months. His credit score had plummeted so low that he couldn't even qualify for a basic credit card, let alone a mortgage. But that diploma still hung in the living room, still caught the afternoon light, still represented everything the family valued: education, ambition, the promise of success in the traditional sense. It didn't matter that Jake had squandered every opportunity, made every wrong choice, ignored every warning sign. He was still the golden child, still the one with potential, still the son they bragged about to their friends. I wondered sometimes what would have happened if I'd stayed in college, if I'd never enlisted, if I'd chosen the safe path they'd wanted. For me, would I have ended up like Jake, impressive on paper, but hollow underneath? Or would I have found something real, something meaningful, something that couldn't be repossessed or lost in a market crash? The military had taught me the value of things that couldn't be taken away: honor, loyalty, the bond between soldiers, the satisfaction of service to something bigger than yourself. These weren't concepts that fit neatly into a frame or looked good on a resume, but they were real in a way that Jake's achievements never seemed to be. As I stood in my parents' living room, looking at that diploma, I felt a mixture of sadness and anger. Sadness for the years I'd spent trying to earn their approval, anger at the blind favoritism that had shaped our family for so long. But underneath it all, I felt something else, a quiet confidence that I'd made the right choices, even if they'd never understood or appreciated them. Jake's diploma represented everything they thought they wanted. But when crisis came, when they needed someone reliable, someone with real resources and real connections, they'd have to come to me. The son they'd dismissed, the one whose service they'd never valued, the one whose benefits they'd called handouts. That irony was about to become very, very real. Emma's business cards were scattered across her kitchen table like confetti after a failed party. TechFlow Solutions. They read in sleek, modern font, innovative software development for the digital age. The embossed logo had cost her $300 alone, money she'd justified as investment in brand identity. 8 months? That's how long TechFlow Solutions had lasted before the creditors started calling. Emma had always been the practical one, according to family lore. While Jake chased big dreams and I wasted time in the military, Emma was building something real, something tangible. She'd started 3 different businesses in 5 years, each one failing spectacularly. But somehow, each failure was reframed as learning experience and entrepreneurial spirit. The family had rallied around every venture. When she'd started her first campagna, boutique marketing firm, Dad had been her first client, paying premium rates for services he could have gotten elsewhere for half the price. Mom had organized a launch party, inviting all their friends and neighbors. Even Jake had invested $5,000. Money he could barely afford even before his own financial collapse. I'd offered to help with the business plan, to review her financials, to share some of the organizational skills I'd learned in the military. Thanks, but I've got this handled, she'd said with that condescending smile. This is more of a creative process than a military operation. The creative process had led to bankruptcy within 18 months. Her second venture, an organic meal delivery service, had lasted even less time. The third, a social media consulting company, had folded before it even officially launched. And now, TechFlow Solutions joined the graveyard of Emma's abandoned dreams, leaving behind nothing but expensive business cards and a mountain of debt. But through it all, the family narrative never changed. Emma was still the entrepreneur, still the one with vision and drive. Her failures were just stepping stones to eventual success. My steady job, my reliable income, my careful financial planning, these were signs of limited thinking, of settling for less than my potential. I remembered the last time I'd seen Emma before her latest business imploded. She'd been at Mom and Dad's house, laptop open on the dining room table, talking animatedly about her latest app idea. Something about connecting freelancers with small businesses, disrupting the traditional employment model. The beauty of the gig economy, she'd explained to our parents, who nodded along despite understanding none of it, is that it frees people from the constraints of traditional employment. No more corporate structure, no more government benefits keeping you trapped in mediocrity. That last part had been aimed at me. Emma had always been particularly dismissive of my VA benefits, calling them government handouts and suggesting they were keeping me from achieving my full potential. In her view, my health care, my education benefits, my home loan guarantees, these were crutches that prevented me from taking the risks necessary for real success. Michael's playing it safe, she'd said once at a family dinner. The military takes care of everything for you, and then the VA keeps taking care of you afterward. Where's the challenge in that? Where's the growth? The growth, I'd wanted to tell her, was in learning to lead under pressure, in developing the discipline to complete missions when lives depended on it, in building the kind of character that didn't crumble at the first sign of adversity. But I'd kept quiet, as usual, letting her have her moment of superiority. Now her app was dead, her company was bankrupt, and she was living in a studio apartment because she couldn't afford the rent. On her trendy downtown loft, the freelancers she'd promised to connect were left hanging, and the small businesses that had paid her upfront fees were threatening legal action. But even now, even with TechFlow Solutions reduced to expensive business cards and empty promises, Emma remained convinced that her approach was right and mine was wrong. She was still the practical one, still the entrepreneur, still the family member with vision and ambition. The irony was suffocating. Emma, who'd mocked my benefits as government handouts, was now facing eviction. Emma, who'd criticized my risk-averse approach to finances, was considering bankruptcy. Emma, who dismissed my military experience as irrelevant to the modern world, was discovering that discipline and planning actually mattered. I'd tried to help her, tried to offer advice based on the organizational skills I'd learned in the military. I'd suggested she start smaller, build a foundation before expanding, create systems that could handle growth. But she'd waved off my suggestions as old-fashioned thinking and corporate mindset. Now she was paying the price for her credit was destroyed, her savings were gone, and her reputation in the local business community was in ruins. She'd learned the hard way that vision without execution was just daydreaming, that ambition without discipline was just fantasy. Scattered business cards on her table told the whole story. Beautiful design, premium materials, impressive titles, all surface, no substance. They represented everything that was wrong with how my family measured success. Appearance over reality, potential over performance, dreams over discipline. Swept a few of the cards into my palm, feeling their expensive weight. $300 for business cards for a company that lasted 8 months. I thought about my own business cards from the VA, plain white cardstock, basic black ink, no embossing or special finishes. They weren't impressive to look at, but they represented something real, something lasting, something that helped people rebuild their lives. Emma's cards would end up in the trash, along with all her other failed ventures. My work would continue, steady and reliable, helping veterans navigate the system, connecting them with the benefits they'd earned through service. The practical one, indeed. The Purple Heart sat in my sock drawer, wrapped in tissue paper like a shameful secret. I had been awarded it after an IED explosion in Afghanistan took shrapnel from my leg and left me with a permanent limp that most people never noticed. The Army had called it valor under fire. I'd dragged 2 wounded soldiers to safety before collapsing from blood loss. My parents had called it just doing your job. They'd never asked to see the medal, never requested the story behind it. When I'd mentioned it once, Dad had nodded absently and changed the subject to Jake's latest promotion. Mom had made a concerned face and asked if I was getting the help I needed from the VA, as if my service record was a medical condition requiring treatment. Meanwhile, Jake's college awards lined the hallway leading to their bedroom. Dean's List certificates, Honor Society recognition, academic achievement plaques, all professionally framed and carefully arranged. Visitors couldn't walk through the house without seeing evidence of Jake's success. My military decorations gathered dust in boxes, out of sight and out of mind. "We just worry about you, honey," Mom had said once when I'd tried to explain what my service meant to me. "All that violence, all that trauma, we wanted something better for you." Something better, as if serving my country, protecting freedom, defending the values they claimed to hold dear, as if none of that qualified as better, as if the brotherhood I'd found in the military, the sense of purpose that had shaped my entire adult life, was somehow less valuable than a corporate job or a college degree. Dad's relationship with my military service was more complicated. He'd been too young for Vietnam, too old for the Gulf War. Part of him seemed to respect what I'd done, but that respect was always tempered by regret for the path I hadn't taken. "You could have done anything," he'd say, the implication clear, that I'd chosen poorly. The thing that hurt most was their complete lack of understanding about what military service actually meant. They saw only the dangers, the deployments, the time away from building a normal life. They couldn't comprehend the leadership skills I'd developed, the ability to perform under pressure, the unbreakable bonds formed with fellow soldiers. When I'd come home from my first deployment, they'd thrown a small welcome party, but even then, the focus had been on my return to normal life, on putting the military experience behind me and moving on to something more conventional. They'd invited neighbors and family friends, and every conversation had centered on my plans for the future college career, settling down as if my military service was just a temporary detour from my real life. I'd tried to explain the satisfaction of completing missions, the pride in earning the respect of my fellow soldiers, the deep sense of purpose that came from serving something greater than myself, but their eyes would glaze over, and they'd steer the conversation back to practical matters, benefits, education, opportunities, job prospects. It was during my second deployment that I'd truly understood how they saw me. Jake had gotten engaged while I was overseas, and the family had planned an elaborate engagement party. I'd participated via video call, my face pixelated and delayed, on their laptop screen while they celebrated in person. Even through the poor connection, I could see the contrast. Jake surrounded by family and friends, the center of attention and pride, while I was literally an afterthought, a distant voice from a world they'd rather forget. The questions they asked during those video calls revealed everything. Never, "How are you handling the stress of combat?" or "Are you proud of the work you're doing?" Instead, it was always, "Are you ready to come home and start your real life? And have you thought about what you want to do when this is over?" As if defending their freedom wasn't real, as if leading soldiers in combat wasn't valuable experience, as if the skills I was learning, crisis management, strategic thinking, team leadership, weren't applicable to civilian life. They'd celebrated Jake's graduation with a dinner party for 30 people. They'd marked Emma's first business launch with champagne and speeches about entrepreneurial spirit. When I'd been promoted to sergeant, they'd sent a congratulatory text message. The pattern was clear, had been clear for years. Academic achievements mattered. Business success mattered. Military service was something to be tolerated, perhaps quietly appreciated, but never celebrated. I was the son who'd chosen the hard path, the dangerous path, the path that worried them and made them uncomfortable. Other military families understood. I'd seen it at bases around the world, parents who wore their children's service like a badge of honor, who understood that military leadership was among the most demanding and valuable experience a person could have. But my parents saw only the sacrifice, never the honor, only the danger, never the nobility. The most painful part was their obvious relief when I'd finally left active duty. They'd tried to hide it, but I could see the hope in their eyes finally. Their son could join the real world, get a normal job, live a conventional life. They'd never understood that the military hadn't been a detour for my real life. It had been the foundation of everything I'd become. Now, as their carefully constructed world fell apart around them, they were about to discover the value of what they'd dismissed for so long. The son they'd worried about, the one whose service they'd never quite understood, was the only one with the resources and connections to save them. The Purple Heart in my sock drawer represented more than a moment of courage under fire. It represented a lifetime of service they'd never valued, sacrifice they'd never appreciated, and strength they'd never recognized. But they were about to learn. The letters from home arrived sporadically, thin envelopes that felt more like obligations than connections, while other soldiers received care packages filled with hometown treats and heartfelt notes. My mail consisted of duty-bound updates about local weather and Jake's latest achievements. My first deployment to Iraq came right after Jake's college graduation. The timing couldn't have been worse or more symbolic. While I was learning to navigate improvised explosive devices and coordinate supply convoys through hostile territory, Jake was being celebrated at graduation parties and job interviews. The contrast wasn't lost on me when I'd read Mom's letters, which were filled with details about Jake's job offers and Emma's summer internship, with my dangerous reality reduced to hope. You're staying safe over there. The disconnect was profound. I'd write about the responsibility of leading a squad, about the split-second decisions that kept my soldiers alive, about the pride I felt in completing missions that mattered. In return, I'd get updates about neighborhood barbecues and questions about whether I was ready to come home and start planning for your future. During my second deployment to Afghanistan, I'd been promoted to squad leader, 22 years old, responsible for the lives of 8 soldiers, making decisions that had life or death consequences. I had written home about the weight of leadership, about earning the trust of men who followed me into danger. Mom had responded with news about Jake's engagement and Emma's new business plan. It was during that deployment that I'd truly understood what family meant and what it didn't. My squad became my brothers in ways my actual brother never had. We'd shared foxholes and near-death experiences, celebrated small victories, and mourned losses together. When Rodriguez got shrapnel in his shoulder, we'd all felt it. When Williams received a Dear John letter, we'd all supported him through it. Meanwhile, my actual family sent generic care packages with items I'd never requested and letters that felt like they were written to a stranger. They asked about the weather in Afghanistan, as if I were on vacation. They sent magazine clippings about career opportunities for veterans, as if I were already planning my exit strategy. The third deployment had been the hardest. Not because of the combat though, there'd been plenty of that, but because of the growing distance I felt from home. By then, I'd been promoted to sergeant, leading larger operations and training new soldiers. The responsibility was immense, the stress constant, but the satisfaction of doing meaningful work was undeniable. I'd written a long letter to Dad about what leadership meant, about the honor of serving alongside the best men I'd ever known, about the pride I felt in representing our country. His response had been brief: "Glad you're safe." Jake got promoted to senior analyst. Emma's business is doing well. Looking forward to having you home soon. The word home had started to lose meaning. Home was where people understood your work, valued your contributions, shared your struggles. Home was where you belonged. By those standards, I'd found more of a home in the military than I'd ever had with my family. My squad knew about my family's attitude toward my service. During mail call, they'd joke about my duty letters while reading their own emotional correspondence from parents who missed them, worried about them, and were proud of them. Martinez's mother sent religious medals and wrote about praying for his safety. Chen's father, a Vietnam veteran, sent tactical advice and encouragement about carrying on the family tradition of service. My letters were different, and everyone knew it. They were polite, distant, filled with small talk and subtle hints about coming home to a real career. Even my fellow soldiers could sense the lack of warmth, the absence of pride, the underlying message that what we were doing wasn't quite legitimate in my family's eyes. That it was during that third deployment that I'd been wounded, the IED explosion, that earned me the Purple Heart. The blast had thrown me against a concrete wall, filling my leg with shrapnel and leaving me with a concussion that took weeks to fully resolve. But in the chaos of the explosion, I'd managed to drag 2 wounded soldiers to safety before collapsing from blood loss. The other soldiers had written home about the incident, calling me a hero, describing my actions in detail to their families. Their parents had sent me letters of gratitude, thanking me for protecting their sons. Some had even sent care packages specifically for me, acknowledging the sacrifice I'd made for their children. My own family's response had been characteristically restrained. Mom had called it frightening and asked if I was reconsidering my career choices. Dad had expressed gratitude that I was okay, but followed it immediately with questions about whether this injury might affect my future job prospects. No one had asked about the soldiers I'd saved. No one had expressed pride in my actions. The wounded soldiers I'd helped had written me letters of thanks, telling me how my quick thinking had saved their lives. Their families had reached out, expressing gratitude that their sons were coming home because of my actions. But my own family had treated the incident as a medical event, not a moment of heroism. That's when I'd truly understood the difference between the family you're born into and the family you choose. My brothers in arms had become my real family, the people who understood the value of service, who appreciated sacrifice, who recognized honor when they saw it. The military had taught me about loyalty, about standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves, about the importance of keeping your word even when it cost you everything. These weren't abstract concepts. They were daily realities that shaped how I approached every situation. As I prepared to return from my final deployment, I'd already begun to change. The letters from home still arrived with their casual dismissal of my service, but they no longer had the power to hurt me. I'd found my identity in the military, discovered my strengths as a leader, and learned the true meaning of family from the soldiers who'd served beside me. I was coming home a different person, more confident, more self-aware, and with a clearer understanding of what really mattered. The family that had dismissed my service was about to meet the man that service had created. The Veterans Benefits Handbook was dog-eared and highlighted, margins filled with my careful notes, while other returning soldiers struggled to navigate the complex system of post-service benefits. I'd made it my mission to understand every program, every entitlement, every opportunity I'd earned through my years of service. My family saw this as obsessive, another sign that I was having trouble moving on from my military experience. They'd watch me reading through benefit explanations and qualification requirements with the same concerned expression they'd worn when I'd come home from deployments with a slight limp and occasional nightmares. "You don't have to squeeze every penny out of the government," Dad had said once, watching me research education benefits. "You're smart enough to succeed on your own." He didn't understand that this wasn't about getting something for nothing. These benefits weren't handouts, they were compensation for service, earned through years of sacrifice and dedication. The VA home loan wasn't charity. It was recognition that someone who'd served their country deserved help achieving the American dream of homeownership. But my family's attitude toward my benefits reflected their broader view of my military service. They saw it as a phase I needed to move beyond, not a foundation I could build upon. When I'd enrolled in college using my GI Bill benefits, they'd been pleased finally. Their son was getting a real education. When I'd landed a job with the VA, they'd been supportive. Government work was steady, if unambitious. What they couldn't grasp was how fundamentally the military had changed me. I'd left home as an uncertain teenager, unsure of my place in the world. I'd returned as a confident leader, someone who'd been tested under the worst possible conditions, and emerged stronger. The transition hadn't been easy. Civilian life moved at a different pace, operated by different rules. In the military, competence was rewarded, leadership was respected, and mission accomplishment was the ultimate goal. In civilian life, politics often mattered more than performance, and style could triumph over substance. My family wanted me to fit back into the role I'd occupied before enlisting, the underachieving younger son who needed guidance and direction. They couldn't see that I'd already found my direction, that I'd developed capabilities and confidence they'd never recognized in me. I'd started working at the VA while finishing my degree, using the organizational skills I'd learned in the military to help other veterans navigate the system. The work was satisfying in a way that my family couldn't understand. I wasn't just processing paperwork. I was helping people who'd served their country access the benefits they'd earned. My colleagues at the VA understood me in ways my family never had. They respected my military experience, valued my leadership background, and appreciated the unique perspective I brought to the work. When I'd been promoted to senior analyst, they'd celebrated genuinely, recognizing the achievement for what it was. My family's reaction had been more muted. "That's nice, honey," Mom had said, already shifting the conversation to Jake's latest project. They couldn't see that my promotion represented recognition of the leadership skills I'd developed in the military, the ability to handle complex situations and manage multiple priorities simultaneously. The irony was that my military training had prepared me for exactly the kind of crisis management that Jake and Emma had failed at spectacularly. I'd learned to plan for contingencies, to build redundant systems, to always have backup options. While they'd been taking enormous risks with their finances and careers, I'd been building a stable foundation. My approach to personal finances reflected this military-trained mindset. I'd bought a modest house using my VA home loan, built an emergency fund, invested conservatively but consistently. While Jake had been leveraging himself to the hilt and Emma had been burning through startup capital, I'd been steadily building, well, through careful planning and disciplined execution. But this cautious approach was seen as lack of ambition by my family. They couldn't understand that I'd already taken the biggest risk of my life serving in combat zones where split-second decisions could mean the difference between life and death. After that kind of pressure, civilian challenges seemed manageable, not because they were easy, but because I had developed the tools to handle them. The handbook in my hands represented more than just benefit information. It was a roadmap to building the life I'd earned through service, a guide to maximizing the opportunities I'd been given. Every highlighted section, every margin note, every cross-reference was part of a larger strategy to ensure I never wasted the potential my military service had created. I'd learned to read the fine print, to understand the system, to work within established procedures to achieve my goals. While my family had been impressed by Jake's flashy investment strategies and Emma's entrepreneurial dreams, I'd been quietly building something more solid and sustainable. My military experience had taught me that real success wasn't about taking wild risks or chasing quick profits. It was about consistent performance, reliable leadership, and the ability to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining core principles. These weren't qualities that looked impressive on paper, but they were the foundation of everything meaningful I'd accomplished. The transformation wasn't just professional, it was personal. I'd developed confidence in my own judgment, learned to trust my instincts, and discovered that I could handle whatever life threw at me. The uncertain teenager who'd left home had been replaced by a self-assured adult who knew his worth and wouldn't accept being diminished by others. My family was about to discover this new version of me. The son they'd dismissed, the one whose service they'd never quite understood, was no longer the insecure young man who desperately sought their approval. I'd found my identity in service, my confidence in achievement, and my strength in adversity. The benefits handbook represented just one aspect of what I'd gained from my military service, but it was about to become the most important one for my family's future. The foreclosure notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, tucked between credit card offers and grocery store flyers like a bomb disguised as junk mail. Mom called me at work, her voice shaking as she read the legal terminology that meant they had 90 days to save their dream home or lose everything. "I don't understand," she kept saying. "We've never missed a payment. We've been good customers for 15 years. What she didn't understand was that being a good customer meant nothing when the bank decided to call in their home equity line of credit. Dad had used the house as collateral for a business investment 2 years earlier, something about helping Jake get back on his feet after his first major financial setback. Now that investment had gone south, Jake couldn't repay the loan, and the bank wanted their money. The house had been their pride and joy, the symbol of everything they'd worked for. 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, perfectly manicured lawn, and a kitchen that Mom had renovated twice. It was the house where Jake had brought his fiancée for family dinners, where Emma had planned her business launches, where they'd hosted countless gatherings to show off their successful life. Now it was about to be sold at auction. I drove over that evening to find them sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by financial documents and legal papers. Dad looked older than I'd ever seen him, his face gray with exhaustion and stress. Mom was crying quietly, dabbing at her eyes with tissue after tissue. "How bad is it?" I asked, taking a seat across from them. Dad handed me a stack of papers. The numbers were worse than I'd imagined. The home equity loan had been for $200,000, used to cover Jake's investment losses and provide startup capital for Emma's latest business venture. Both children had promised to repay their portions, but neither had been able to deliver on those promises. Now the bank was foreclosing on the collateral. The house that had been in the family for over a decade, the place where all their memories lived, their primary asset and their source of financial security. "We tried to refinance," Mom said through her tears. "But with the economy the way it is, and our age, and the debt we already have, double quotes, the refinance had been rejected. Their credit scores, once pristine, had been damaged by the missed payments on Jake's loans and Emma's business debts. They were too old to qualify for a traditional 30-year mortgage, too debt-heavy to qualify for better rates, and too proud to declare bankruptcy." "Where are Jake and Emma?" I asked, looking around the empty house. Mom and Dad exchanged glances. "Jake's dealing with his own situation," Dad said carefully. "His credit is in rough shape right now. Emma's exploring some options, but her business situation is complicated." Translation: neither of the golden children could help. Jake's financial irresponsibility had finally caught up with him, and Emma's entrepreneurial dreams had left her with nothing but debt and false promises. I spent the next hour reviewing their financial situation in detail. The picture was grim. They'd borrowed against their retirement accounts to cover previous family emergencies. Their savings had been depleted by a series of temporary loans to Jake and Emma that had never been repaid. The house was their last major asset, and they were about to lose it. "What about downsizing?" I suggested. "Maybe we could find something smaller, more affordable." "With what down payment?" Dad asked bitterly. "With what credit score? We're 64 and 62 years old, Michael. Nobody's going to give us a mortgage at this point." The despair in his voice was heartbreaking. These were people who'd worked their entire lives, saved responsibly, made careful decisions. Their only mistake had been trusting their children's promises and using their financial security to support Jake and Emma's risky ventures. "We built this life for our kids," Mom said softly. "We wanted to leave them something, to give them a foundation to build on. Instead, we're going to lose everything." I looked around the kitchen where I'd eaten countless meals, where homework had been completed and family arguments had been resolved. The house represented stability, success, the American dream achieved through hard work and determination. The thought of losing it was devastating, but as I studied the foreclosure notice, something else occurred to me. This wasn't just about saving my parents' house, it was about the family's entire future. If they lost the house, they'd have nowhere to go, no financial foundation to rebuild on. At their age, with their damaged credit, they'd be looking at years of financial struggle and uncertainty. Meanwhile, I had resources they didn't know about. My VA home loan benefit could secure financing that traditional borrowers couldn't access. My steady employment, good credit, and government backing made me an attractive candidate for lenders. I had the ability to help them if I chose to. The irony wasn't lost on me. The son whose service they'd dismissed as a waste of potential, whose benefits they'd called government handouts, was the only one with the resources to save them. Jake, the financial genius, was broke and desperate. Emma, the entrepreneur, was facing bankruptcy. Only the soldier they'd never quite understood had the tools to rescue the family. I folded the foreclosure notice and slipped it into my pocket. "Let me make some calls," I said. "There might be options we haven't considered." Dad looked up with the first hope I'd seen in his eyes all evening. "You think there's something we can do?" I stood up, feeling the weight of the decision ahead of me. "I think there's always something we can do. The question is whether we're willing to do it." As I drove home that night, I couldn't stop thinking about the house, about my parents' tears, about the consequences of Jake and Emma's failures. The family that had never valued my service was about to discover its true worth. The benefits they'd dismissed as handouts were about to become their salvation. The foreclosure notice in my pocket felt like a test not just of my financial resources, but of my character, my values, and my definition of family loyalty. The question was, what kind of test did I want it to be? The stack of rejection letters grew thicker each day. First National Bank, Community Credit Union, online lenders with names like Quick Cash and Easy Money. Each denial was more devastating than the last, crushing another piece of my parents' hope along with their financial future. Credit score too low, debt-to-income ratio unfavorable, insufficient collateral, age-related lending restrictions. The language was clinical, but the message was clear. At 64 and 62, with damaged credit and depleted savings, my parents were no longer considered creditworthy by anyone. I'd been watching the process unfold with a mixture of sadness and fascination. These were people who'd paid their bills on time for 40 years, who'd built successful careers and raised a family. But a few poor decisions trusting Jake's investment advice, supporting Emma's business dreams had destroyed their financial credibility overnight. Dad had approached the applications with the same methodical precision he'd brought to everything else in life. He'd researched lenders, gathered documentation, prepared detailed financial statements. Each application had been submitted with hope and confidence, as if surely someone would recognize their fundamental creditworthiness despite the recent setbacks. Each rejection had been a blow to that confidence, a reminder that their financial security was more fragile than they'd realized. The man who'd always been able to solve problems through hard work and careful planning was discovering that some problems couldn't be solved through traditional means. "Maybe we should look at reverse mortgages," Mom suggested one evening, her voice hollow with desperation. "Or those companies that buy houses for cash." I watched Dad's face crumple at the suggestion. A reverse mortgage would allow them to stay in the house, but it would mean giving up their children's inheritance, watching their equity disappear month by month. The cash buyers would offer maybe 60% of the house's value, leaving them with enough money to rent an apartment, but no hope of ever owning a home again. "There has to be something else," Dad said, but his voice lacked conviction. He'd been making calls for weeks, exploring every conventional option, and each conversation had ended the same way. That's when Jake finally showed up, looking haggard and defensive. His expensive clothes couldn't hide the stress that had carved new lines around his eyes. The golden child was facing his own financial apocalypse, and he was discovering that charm and education couldn't fix fundamental problems. "I'm working on it," he said when Dad asked about repaying the loan. "I've got some opportunities developing, some connections that might pan out. I just need a little more time." But time was something they didn't have. The foreclosure process was moving forward with bureaucratic inevitability. Lawyers were filing papers, auction dates were being set, and Jake's opportunities were as insubstantial as his previous promises. Emma arrived the next day, looking equally desperate. Her startup had officially folded, leaving her with nothing but debt and broken promises to investors. The practical daughter, the entrepreneur, the one who was supposed to understand business, she was as helpless as everyone else. "I've been thinking about bankruptcy," she said quietly. "It might be the only way out." Mom started crying again. The word bankruptcy represented everything they'd tried to avoid, the ultimate admission of financial failure. For people who'd built their identity around financial responsibility, it was almost worse than losing the house. "What about Michael's benefits?" Emma asked suddenly. "I know he's got some kind of government loan program. Maybe he could help." The suggestion hung in the air like a lifeline. For the first time in weeks, I saw hope flicker in my parents' eyes. They were finally acknowledging what I'd known all along, that my military service had provided me with resources they couldn't access anywhere else. "I don't know much about it," Dad said carefully, "but if there's something we haven't tried, I felt the family's attention focus on me with an intensity I'd never experienced before. The son they'd dismissed, the one whose service they'd never quite understood, was suddenly the center of their hopes. The benefits they'd called handouts were being reconsidered as potential salvation. "Tell us about this loan program," Mom said, her voice eager with desperation. "How does it work? What would we need to qualify?" I looked around the table at my family, parents who'd never valued my service, siblings who'd mocked my benefits, all of them now hanging on my words with desperate attention. The power dynamic had shifted completely. "The VA home loan guarantee is different from conventional financing," I explained slowly, watching their faces as they absorbed each word. "It's not based on credit scores or debt-to-income ratios the same way. The government backs the loan, which means lenders are willing to take risks they wouldn't normally take. Dad leaned forward, his businessman's instincts kicking in despite his desperation. What are the requirements? What would we need to qualify? We wouldn't qualify, I said quietly. I would. It's my benefit, earned through my military service. I can use it to purchase a home, but it has to be in my name. The silence that followed was deafening. I could see them processing the implications, understanding for the first time that their salvation lay entirely in my hands. The son they'd underestimated held their future in his decision. So you could buy our house? Mom asked tentatively. Take over the mortgage. I could purchase a house, I corrected. Whether that house happens to be this one, and what the terms of that purchase might be, those are separate conversations. Jake shifted uncomfortably in his chair. For the first time in his life, he was completely dependent on his younger brother, the brother he'd always seen as the family underachiever. Emma was studying her hands, the reality of the situation finally sinking in. What would you need from us? Dad asked, his voice carefully neutral. I sat back in my chair, feeling the weight of the moment. Everything was about to change. The family dynamics that had shaped my entire life were being rewritten in real time, and I held the pen. That, I said, is what we need to discuss. The VA certificate of eligibility sat on the kitchen table like a golden ticket, its official government seal catching the overhead light. I'd brought it over the next evening, after a day of phone calls and research, and now my family stared at it with the reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. 27 years of eligibility remaining, I explained, pointing to the relevant section. No down payment required, competitive interest rates, no private mortgage insurance. It's designed to help veterans achieve homeownership as a thank you for their service. Dad picked up the certificate carefully, as if it might disintegrate in his hands. This could really save the house. This could purchase a house, I corrected. Again, what happens to this house? Who lives in it? And under what terms? Those are decisions we'd need to make together. The distinction was important, and I could see them struggling with it. They were used to being in control of their financial destiny, making decisions based on their own resources and creditworthiness. The idea that their future now depended entirely on my goodwill was difficult for them to accept. Mom was the first to break the uncomfortable silence. Michael, honey, we know we haven't always understood your military career. Maybe we didn't appreciate what you were doing over there, what you were learning. But if you can help us save our home, she trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. The words they'd never said hung in the air, words about respect, gratitude, recognition of my service's value. But even now, facing financial ruin, they couldn't quite bring themselves to admit they'd been wrong about me. Jake cleared his throat. Look, Mike, I know I've given you grief about the government benefits thing. Maybe I was wrong about that. If you can help the family out of this mess, I'll make sure you're paid back. I've got some deals in the works that should pan out soon. Emma nodded eagerly. Same here. My next business venture is going to be much more conservative, much more likely to succeed. Whatever you invest in helping us, you'll get back with interest. I looked at my siblings, successful, educated, ambitious people who were now making promises they had no ability to keep. Jake's deals were as fictional as Emma's conservative business plans. They were grasping at straws, saying whatever they thought I wanted to hear. This isn't about money, I said quietly, and it's not about getting paid back. Dad frowned. Then what is it about? I took a deep breath, knowing that this moment would define our family relationships going forward. It's about respect. It's about recognition. It's about acknowledging that my military service to career you've spent years the only thing standing between this family and financial disaster. The words hung heavy in the room. I'd never spoken so directly to my family before, never demanded recognition for my service or called out their dismissive attitude. But the circumstances had changed everything. I was no longer the insecure young man desperate for their approval. Michael, Mom said carefully, we've always been proud of your service. No, I interrupted. You've been politely tolerant of my service. You've treated it like a phase I needed to get through, a detour from my real life. You've never asked about my experiences, never displayed my awards, never understood what it meant to serve. Jake shifted uncomfortably. Come on, that's not fair. We supported you. You supported me the way you'd support someone with a chronic illness. I replied with patience and hope that I'd eventually recover and get back to normal. You never saw my service as valuable in itself. Emma looked up from her hands. But we see it now. We understand how important it was. Do you? I asked. Or do you just understand that you need something from me? The question hit home. I could see the truth in their faces. They still didn't understand or value my service. They were just desperate enough to acknowledge its practical benefits. What do you want from us? Dad asked, his voice tight with stress and barely controlled. Frustration. I pulled out a folded piece of paper from my jacket pocket, the list I'd been working on since our last conversation. If I'm going to use my VA benefit to help this family, there are going to be conditions. Conditions, Jake said, his voice rising slightly. We're a family, Mike. You don't put conditions on helping family. The same family that's never helped me? I asked quietly. The same family that's dismissed my career, mocked my benefits, and treated my service like a waste of potential. The room fell silent again. They were beginning to understand that this wasn't just a financial was a reckoning. Years of dismissive comments, casual disrespect, and benign neglect were finally coming due. "What kind of conditions?" Mom asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I unfolded the paper and set it on the table next to the VA certificate. 2 documents, representing 2 very different approaches to family, one based on entitlement and assumption, the other based on mutual respect and clear expectations. First, I said, reading from my list, acknowledgement, public recognition that my military service provided this family with resources that saved our home. No more calling my benefits government handouts or suggesting I wasted my potential in the military. Dad nodded slowly. This was reasonable, even if it stung their pride. Second, financial responsibility. If I purchase this house, I become the owner. That means I make decisions about maintenance, improvements, and eventual sale. No more borrowing against the house to fund risky investments or failed business ventures. Jake opened his mouth to protest, but I held up a hand. Third, respect. For my decisions, no more family meetings where my input is dismissed or ignored. No more assumptions that my military background makes me unsuitable for important conversations. I looked around the table at my family parents who were realizing their golden children couldn't save them. Siblings who were understanding that their dismissive attitude had consequences. "These aren't punishments," I said, folding the paper back up. "They're the terms under which I'm willing to help. If you can't accept them, then you'll need to find another solution." The certificate of eligibility sat between us like a bridge, their desperate need with my hard-earned resources, but it was a bridge I would only cross on my own terms. With the respect and recognition I'd spent years trying to earn through other means, the power dynamic had shifted completely. For the first time in my life, my family needed me more than I needed their approval. My handwritten list sat on the kitchen table for 3 days before anyone called. I'd left it there deliberately, along with my contact information and a simple note. "Think it over. Call me when you decide." The silence was telling. For the first time in their lives, my parents were faced with the reality that their youngest son, the one they'd never quite understood, held all the cards. They could accept my terms or lose their home. There was no third option, no way to negotiate around the fundamental shift in power that had occurred. Jake called first, his voice carefully controlled. "Mike, about those conditions you mentioned. Some of them seem pretty harsh. I mean, we're family. Family works both ways." "Jake," I replied, "for 34 years I've been the family member who adapted, who accepted less, who swallowed his pride to keep the peace. Now you need something from me, and suddenly you want to talk about family loyalty." There was a long pause. "What if we could modify some of the terms? Make them more ... reasonable." "Which terms do you think are unreasonable?" I asked. "The one where you acknowledge my service has value. The one where you stop making financial decisions that put the family at risk. Or the one where you treat me like an equal adult." He couldn't answer that, because any answer would have required admitting that they'd been treating me as less than equal for years. Emma called that evening, taking a different approach. "Michael, I've been thinking about what you said, and you're right. We haven't always appreciated what you've done, what you've achieved. Maybe we can work something out that addresses your concerns while still keeping this in the family." "It is staying in the family," I said. "It's just staying in the family on different terms than you're used to. But you're talking about owning our parents' house. That changes everything." Everything was already changed when Jake borrowed against the house and couldn't pay it back. Everything was already changed when you couldn't repay the money they lent you for your business. "I'm not changing anything. I'm just the only one with the ability to fix what you and Jake broke." Mom called on the 3rd day, her voice thick with emotion. "Michael, honey, your father and I have been talking. We want to accept your conditions, all of them, all of them. We realize we haven't always been fair to you, haven't always appreciated what your military service meant. If you can save our home, we'll do whatever you ask." I felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction that I was finally getting the recognition I'd craved for so long. Sadness that it had taken their financial desperation to make it happen. "I need to hear it from everyone," I said. "This affects the whole family, and I want everyone to understand what we're agreeing to." We met again that weekend. The same kitchen table, but a completely different dynamic. The foreclosure notice was now just days away from becoming final. My VA certificate was still there, but now it was accompanied by loan application paperwork I'd already begun filling out. "Let's be clear about what we're discussing," I said, looking around the table. "I would use my VA benefit to purchase this house. You would live in it as my tenants, paying rent that covers the mortgage, taxes, and insurance. The house would be in my name, giving me legal authority over all major decisions." Dad's businessman instincts were warring with his desperation. "What about equity? What about appreciation? This house has been our primary asset for 15 years. And you were about to lose it completely," I reminded him. "This way, you keep your home, your neighborhood, your way of life. The equity situation is something we can discuss down the road. But right now, we're talking about keeping you from becoming homeless." Jake was struggling with the reality that his younger brother was about to become the family's primary property owner. What about inheritance? What about passing something down to the next generation? You mean the inheritance you already spent on failed investments? I asked. The equity you already borrowed against for business ventures that didn't work out? There's nothing left to inherit unless we save the house first. Emma was more practical. What would rent be? What would the terms look like? I'd done the math carefully. $1,500 a month, which covers the mortgage payment, property taxes, insurance, and a small maintenance fund. That's about $300 less than comparable rental properties in this neighborhood. Mom started crying again, but this time they were tears of relief. You'd really do this for us. I'm doing this for the family, I said, but the family that emerges from this crisis is going to be different from the one that got us into it. I pulled out additional paperwork, lease agreements, property management contracts, and formal documentation of the new arrangement. If we're going to do this, we're going to do it right. Legal agreements, clear expectations, proper boundaries. Dad looked overwhelmed by the paperwork. This seems so formal, so businesslike. We're family. Family without boundaries is how we got into this mess, I replied. Jake borrowed money from family without legal agreements and couldn't pay it back. Emma took family investments without formal terms and lost everything. The informality that you're comfortable with is exactly what created this crisis. I spread the documents across the table, each one representing a different aspect of our new relationship. These agreements protect everyone. They protect you from arbitrary rent increases or eviction. They protect me from the same kind of informal borrowing that got us here in the first place. Jake was reading through the lease agreement, his face growing more troubled with each page. This is really comprehensive. You've thought of everything. The military teaches you to plan for contingencies, I said, to think through all possible scenarios and prepare for them. It's one of those skills you never valued until now. Emma looked up from the property management contract. You've already talked to lawyers about this. I've talked to lawyers, lenders, and real estate agents. I've researched comparable properties, analyzed the local market, and prepared for multiple scenarios. This isn't a spur-of-a-moment decision. It's a carefully planned operation. The word operation hung in the air. Military terminology applied to a family crisis. But that's what this was, a mission to save the family home. Executed with the same precision and planning I'd brought to military operations overseas. When would this happen? Mom asked. The loan process takes 30 to 45 days once we submit the application. The foreclosure auction is scheduled for 6 weeks from now. If we start immediately, we can close before the auction date. Dad was studying the timeline I'd prepared, complete with milestones, contingencies, and backup plans. You've really thought this through? I've been thinking this through since the day you got the foreclosure notice, I said. While everyone else was panicking or denial or looking for miracle solutions, I was developing an actual plan. I stood up, feeling the weight of leadership settling on my shoulders the way it had countless times in the military. This is your last chance to back out. Once we start this process, we're committed. The family you've known is going to change, and there's no going back. They looked around the table at each other, then back at me. For the first time in my life, I saw them looking at me not as the family disappointment, but as the family leader, the son who'd found a way to save them all. The Purple Heart lay in its case on the kitchen table. The purple ribbon faded, but the metal itself still gleaming. I'd finally brought it out of the sock drawer, along with my other service decorations, forcing my family to confront the reality of what I'd experienced during my deployments. I never knew you had all of these, Mom said softly, touching the edge of the case. Her voice carried a mixture of awe and shame, awe at the recognition. I'd earned shame at never having asked to see it before. The Army Commendation Medal sat next to the Purple Heart, along with my Combat Action Badge, deployment ribbons, and unit citations. Together, they told the story of my military service in a way that words never could. Each decoration represented specific actions, particular moments of courage or competence that had been witnessed and recognized by my commanding officers. This one, I said, pointing to the Purple Heart, was awarded after an IED explosion in Afghanistan. I was leading a convoy through a known danger zone when we hit an improvised explosive device. The blast threw me against a concrete barrier and filled my left leg with shrapnel. Dad leaned forward, studying the medal with new interest. You never told us the details. You never asked for the details, I replied. When I called from the hospital, you asked if I was okay and whether this would affect my future job prospects. When I came home on medical leave, you asked if I was ready to start thinking about civilian careers. The truth was painful but necessary. They'd been so focused on getting me out of the military and into what they considered a real career that they'd never bothered to understand what I'd actually accomplished during my service. After the explosion, I continued, I managed to pull 2 wounded soldiers out of the vehicle and drag them to cover before collapsing from blood loss. That's what earned me the Purple Heart, not just being wounded, but continuing to function. As a leader, even while injured, Emma was reading the citation that accompanied the medal, her face growing pale as she absorbed the official language describing my actions. Michael, I had no idea. you saved people's lives. That was my job, I said simply. Squad leaders take care of their soldiers. You don't leave people behind, and you don't stop functioning just because you're hurt. Jake was examining the combat action badge, which identified soldiers who had engaged the enemy in ground combat. How many times were you in actual combat? More than I cared to remember, less than some of my fellow soldiers. I wasn't being evasive, the specific number didn't matter. What mattered was that I'd been tested under the worst possible conditions, and had performed well enough to earn the respect of my peers and superiors. The Army Commendation Medal, I explained, pointing to another decoration, was for leadership during a particularly difficult operation. We had to establish a supply route through hostile territory, coordinate with local forces, and maintain security for civilian contractors. It required strategic thinking, cultural sensitivity, and the ability to adapt quickly when situations changed. Dad was studying the medal with the same intensity he brought to business contracts. These aren't just participation trophies, are they? These represent real achievements. The military doesn't give out awards for showing up, I said. Every decoration has specific criteria, requires witness statements, and goes through multiple levels of review. You earn them by demonstrating competence under pressure. Mom picked up one of my deployment ribbons, turning it over in her hands. 3 deployments. You were gone for almost 4 years total. 4 years when you were needed most, she continued, her voice thick with emotion. 4 years when we should have been supporting you, asking about your experiences, being proud of what you were doing. The admission hung in the air between us. For the first time, my mother was acknowledging that they'd failed me as a family, that their lack of interest in my military service had been a form of emotional abandonment. I wrote letters, I said quietly. I tried to share what I was experiencing, what I was learning about leadership and responsibility and working with people from different backgrounds, but you always responded with questions about when I was coming home, when I was going to start my real life. Jake was reading through some of the unit citations. Official recognition for my squad's performance during specific operations. These are impressive, Mike, really impressive. I just ... We just never understood what they meant, because you never tried to understand, I said, not unkindly, but with complete honesty. You had already decided that military service was a waste of my potential, so you weren't interested in evidence that contradicted that assumption. I pulled out a folder of letters correspondence from soldiers I'd served with, from commanding officers, thank you notes from families of soldiers I'd helped. This is what my service meant to the people who were there, who understood what we were doing. Emma was reading a letter from the parents of a soldier I'd mentored, thanking me for helping their son develop the confidence and skills to succeed in the military. They call you a natural leader. They say their son wouldn't have made it without your guidance. Leadership isn't something you learn in business school, I said. It's something you develop by being responsible for other people's lives, by making decisions when failure isn't an option, by earning trust in situations where trust can mean the difference between life and death. Dad was examining a recommendation letter from my commanding officer, praising my ability to manage complex logistics under combat conditions. This officer says you could have been a career military leader. Why didn't you stay in? It was a question they'd never asked before, and the answer revealed another layer of their misunderstanding. Because I'd accomplished what I set out to accomplish. I'd proven to myself that I could handle responsibility, that I could lead people through difficult situations, that I could serve something bigger than myself. I didn't need a 20-year career to validate those achievements. I gathered the medals and letters back into their cases, each one representing a piece of the man I'd become through military service. These decorations don't define me, but they represent the experiences that shaped my character, the leadership skills that are helping me navigate this family crisis, the planning abilities that developed our current strategy, the confidence to set boundaries and demand respect. All of that came from my military service. Mom was crying again, but these tears were different. They weren't tears of desperation or fear, they were tears of recognition, of understanding what they'd missed, of regret for the years of dismissive comments and casual disrespect. We failed you, she said simply. We were so focused on what we thought success should look like that we couldn't see the success you'd actually achieved. You didn't fail me, I replied. You just didn't understand me. But that's changing now, because this crisis has forced you to see the value of what you dismissed. I stood up, feeling the weight of revelation settling over the room. The son you thought had wasted his potential is the only one with the resources to save this family. The career you thought was a detour from my real life turned out to be preparation for exactly this moment. The medals sat on the table between us, tangible proof of a service record they'd never bothered to examine. But more than that, they represented a fundamental shift in how my family saw me and how I saw myself in relation to them. For the first time in my life, they were seeing me as I really was. Not the family disappointment, but the family's salvation. Jake's investment portfolio statement lay spread across my coffee table like evidence at a crime scene. Page after page of red numbers, failed ventures, and catastrophic losses that told the story of the golden child's spectacular fall from grace. Cryptocurrency mining startup total loss. Tech bubble speculation 80% loss. Leveraged, real estate investments foreclosure proceedings initiated. I read through the casualties of his investment strategy while Jake sat across from me, his usual confidence replaced by hollow-eyed desperation. I was following the conventional wisdom, he said weakly. Diversified portfolio, high growth potential, calculated risks based on market analysis. Calculated risks, I repeated, looking at another page. You put $60,000 into a company that claimed they could revolutionize social media through blockchain integration. Did you research their business model, their leadership, team, their actual technology? Jake shifted uncomfortably. The prospectus looked solid. They had backing from some major investors. They had backing from other people who didn't do their homework. I corrected. The company folded 6 months after taking your money. The CEO disappeared with the remaining funds. It was a classic pump and dump scheme that anyone with basic due diligence could have spotted. The irony was overwhelming. Jake, the business school graduate with the finance degree, had fallen for every amateur mistake in the book. Meanwhile, I'd been steadily building wealth through boring conservative investments, index funds, blue chip stocks, and my VA home loan benefit. How much total? I asked, though I'd already calculated the damage, including the money I borrowed against the house. About $350,000. The number hung between us like an indictment. $350,000 more than most people made in 5 years, lost to speculation, greed, and fundamental misunderstanding of risk management. That's not even counting the opportunity cost, Jake continued miserably. If I'd just put that money in index funds like you suggested, You didn't want index funds? I reminded him. You called them boring and low ambition. You said people who invested in index funds were settling for mediocrity. I remembered the conversation clearly. Jake had been explaining his investment philosophy at a family dinner, holding court, about the importance of taking calculated risks and thinking outside conventional wisdom. He'd looked at my conservative portfolio with barely concealed disdain. Smart money, he'd said, doesn't follow the crowd. Smart money finds opportunities that others miss. Now his smart money was gone, along with his parents' equity and his own financial future. The calculated risks had turned into guaranteed losses, and the opportunities he'd found had been mirages created by con artists and his own wishful thinking. The worst part, Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper, is that I dragged Mom and Dad down with me. They trusted me because I had the business degree, because I talked a good game about financial strategy. They trusted you because you told them what they wanted to hear, I said. They wanted to believe that their golden child had special insight, that his education made him smarter than everyone else. Jake looked up sharply. That's not fair, isn't it? When I suggested they be careful about leveraging the house, you said I was being too conservative. When I warned them about putting all their eggs in one basket, you said I didn't understand modern portfolio theory. When I offered to review your investment proposals, you said it wasn't necessary because you had everything under control. The accusations hung heavy between us. Jake couldn't deny any of them because they were all true. He'd dismissed my concerns, overruled my cautions, and convinced our parents to trust his judgment over mine. I thought I knew what I was doing, he said finally. No, you thought your degree meant you knew what you were doing. There's a difference. I picked up another document from his portfolio, a margin call notice that had triggered the beginning of his financial collapse. You borrowed money to buy stocks, then used those stocks as collateral to borrow more money to buy more stocks. When the market turned, you got caught in a death spiral that wiped out everything. It's called leverage, Jake said defensively. It's a standard investment technique. It's a standard technique for people who can afford to lose everything, I corrected. You leveraged your parents' house to gamble on cryptocurrency startups. That's not investment strategy, that's addiction. The word hit home. Jake's relationship with high-risk investments had all the hallmarks of gambling addiction, chasing losses with bigger bets, ignoring warning signs, believing that the next big score would fix everything. What am I supposed to do now? Jake asked, his voice breaking. I'm 36 years old, my credit is destroyed, I have no savings, and I've lost everything our parents worked for. You're supposed to learn from this, I said. You're supposed to understand that education isn't the same as wisdom, that confidence isn't the same as competence, and that taking big risks doesn't make you a visionary, it makes you reckless. I gathered up his portfolio statements and handed them back to him. You're also supposed to stop giving financial advice to anyone, including yourself. You've proven that you don't understand risk management, due diligence, or basic portfolio construction. Jake took the papers with shaking hands. You're enjoying this, aren't you? Finally getting to be the successful brother. I'm not enjoying watching our parents face foreclosure because of your poor decisions, I said. I'm not enjoying seeing you destroy your own future through arrogance and speculation. But I am satisfied that reality is finally catching up with the family mythology. What mythology? The mythology that says your business degree makes you automatically smarter about money than your brother, who earned his financial literacy through careful study and conservative practice. The mythology that says taking big risks is more admirable than building wealth slowly and sustainably. I stood up, looking down at my brother, the golden child who'd finally tarnished beyond repair. The military taught me to plan for failure, to always have backup options, to never bet more than I could afford to lose. You were taught to maximize returns and leverage opportunities. Which approach worked better? Jake couldn't answer because the evidence was overwhelming. His aggressive strategy had led to total financial ruin, while my conservative approach had positioned me to save the family. From now on, I continued, you don't make financial decisions for this family, you don't offer investment advice, you don't borrow against family assets, and you don't convince anyone to trust your judgment with money. You're cutting me out completely. I'm protecting the family from your poor judgment, I said, just like the military taught me to identify and neutralize threats to mission success. Jake's face crumpled as the full weight of his fall from grace settled on him. The golden child was now the family liability, the cautionary tale, the brother who'd had every advantage and squandered it all. What about second chances? He asked desperately. What about family forgiveness? Family forgiveness doesn't restore lost money or rebuild destroyed credit, I replied. Second chances have to be earned through changed behavior, not requested through emotional appeals. I walked him to the door, feeling the strange satisfaction of role reversal. For 34 years, Jake had been the successful brother, the one with potential, the family's best hope for financial security. Now, I was the one with resources, stability, and the power to shape the family's future. The house will be saved, I said, as he reached for the doorknob. Mom and Dad will have a place to live, but the family that emerges from this crisis will be very different from the one that got us into it. Jake paused in the doorway, understanding that his position in the family hierarchy had changed forever. The golden child had lost his shine, and his younger brother had stepped into the leadership role he'd never been offered before. The reckoning was complete. Emma's bankruptcy filing papers sat in a manila folder on her kitchen counter, the legal language spelling out the complete collapse of her entrepreneurial dreams. Chapter 7, Liquidation, the kind of bankruptcy that wipes out everything and offers a fresh start to people who've lost control of their financial lives. I always thought bankruptcy was for people who were irresponsible, Emma said, staring at the documents. People who didn't plan ahead, who lived beyond their means, who made stupid decisions. And now? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Now I realize I was all of those things. The admission was painful but necessary. Emma had spent years lecturing the family about financial responsibility, criticizing my government dependence, and promoting the virtues of entrepreneurial risk-taking. Now she was discovering that entrepreneurship, without discipline, was just expensive wishful thinking. Her latest business failure had been particularly devastating because it had seemed so promising. TechFlow Solutions was going to revolutionize small business software, creating custom applications that would streamline operations and increase efficiency. She'd had actual clients, real contracts, and what appeared to be a viable business model. What went wrong? I asked, though I suspected I already knew. Everything, Emma said with a bitter laugh. I underestimated development costs, on delivery timelines, and took on more projects than I could handle. When the first clients started demanding refunds for delayed software, I used money from new clients to pay them back. It became a pyramid scheme without me even realizing it. The business fundamentals she'd ignored were exactly the kind of operational planning I'd learned in the military. Project management, resource allocation, realistic timeline developments that seemed boring but proved essential when executing complex operations. I kept thinking I could work my way out of it, Emma continued. If I could just land one big client, if I could just finish the current projects, if I could just get a bridge loan to cover the gap, there was always a just that was going to fix everything. Military operations don't work that way, I said. You plan for the worst-case scenario, build in redundancies, and always have exit strategies. You never bet the entire mission on everything going perfectly. Emma looked up from the bankruptcy papers. You tried to tell me that, didn't you? When I was starting the company, you offered to help with the business plan. You said you had it handled. You said it was more of a creative process than a military operation. I was wrong. The words came out quietly, but they carried the weight of recognition. I was so convinced that my creativity and vision were more valuable than your systematic approach that I ignored everything you could have taught me. I remembered the conversation clearly. Emma had been excited about her latest venture, full of enthusiasm about disrupting traditional business models and creating innovative solutions. When I'd suggested she start with a smaller proof of concept, build gradually, and maintain conservative cash flow projections, she'd waved off my advice as corporate thinking. The creative process, I said, doesn't exempt you from basic business principles. Cash flow, project management, customer service, these aren't optional components you can ignore while you focus on innovation. Emma was reading through a list of her creditors, each entry representing another relationship destroyed by her business failure. I owe money to suppliers, contractors, clients, and family friends who invested in the company. Some of these people trusted me with their life savings. What about the money Mom and Dad lent you? Gone. All of it. along with everything I'd saved over the past 5 years. Emma's voice was hollow with defeat. I convinced them to invest because I was so sure I was onto something big. I made it sound like a guaranteed return. The pattern was familiar overconfidence, leading to poor decisions, optimism overriding realistic planning, and the assumption that enthusiasm could substitute for competence. Emma had fallen into the same trap as Jake, believing that her education and ambition made her immune to the basic principles that govern financial success. The worst part, Emma said, is that you warned me about this exact scenario. You said I was expanding too fast, taking on too much debt, promising things I couldn't deliver. I called you pessimistic. I called it risk management. I corrected. In the military, pessimism keeps people alive. You plan for failure so you can succeed despite obstacles. I pulled out my phone and showed her a spreadsheet I'd been maintaining for 2 years, a simple financial tracking system that monitored my income, expenses, investments, and savings goals. This is what boring looks like. No dramatic innovations, no revolutionary breakthroughs, just steady progress toward realistic objectives. Emma studied the spreadsheet with the same attention she'd once devoted to her business plans. You've increased your net worth by 40% in 2 years, through index fund investments, mortgage principal payments, and consistent savings. The same mediocre approach you criticized at family dinners. While I was losing everything chasing the next big opportunity, the comparison was stark. While Emma had been bouncing from one failed venture to another, burning through savings and accumulating debt. I'd been building wealth through methodical execution of a conservative plan. My approach had seemed less exciting, but it had produced actual results. I need to ask you something, Emma said, setting down the bankruptcy papers, and I want you to be completely honest with me. Go ahead. Do you think I have what it takes to be a successful entrepreneur? Not what I think I have, not what the family thinks I have, what you actually think, based on what you've observed. The question hung between us, loaded with years of family mythology and personal delusion. Emma had been the practical daughter, the one with business sense, the future CEO who would build something meaningful. Now she was asking me to shatter that mythology with honest assessment. I think you have creativity and enthusiasm, I said carefully. I think you're intelligent and capable of learning. But I don't think you have the discipline or patience required for successful entrepreneurship. Emma flinched but didn't argue. Why not? Because entrepreneurship is mostly boring execution of basic business principles. It's cash flow management, customer service, operational efficiency, and gradual improvement. The exciting innovation part is maybe 5% of the work. The other 95% is the systematic stuff you don't want to do. I picked up one of her old business plans, filled with innovative concepts and market disruption theories, but light on operational details. You love the vision phase, imagining new possibilities, designing elegant solutions, pitching revolutionary concepts, but you lose interest when it's time for the implementation phase, tracking expenses, managing timelines, handling customer complaints. That stuff is tedious, Emma protested, then caught herself. I mean, I know it's important, but double quotes, but you don't want to do it, I finished. Which is fine, but it means you're not suited for entrepreneurship. You're suited for roles where other people handle the tedious stuff while you focus on creativity and innovation. Emma was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications of my assessment. So what should I do? Get a job, I said simply. Work for someone else who can provide the systematic foundation you need. Use your creativity within established structures instead of trying to build those structures yourself. That feels like giving up. It feels like accepting your strengths and limitations, I corrected. The military taught me that successful teams put people in roles that match their capabilities. You've been trying to be something you're not instead of becoming excellent at what you are. Emma looked around her sparse apartment, the physical representation of her entrepreneurial dreams. I used to think you were settling for less by working for the government, by taking the safe path, by avoiding big risks. And now I realize that you were building something sustainable while I was chasing fantasies. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot of her budget apartment complex. I've lost everything, Michael, my savings, my credit, my reputation in the business community, the respect of everyone who invested in my companies. I'm 32 years old and starting over from zero. Not from zero, I said. You're starting from experience. You know what? Doesn't work now, which is valuable knowledge if you apply it correctly. Emma turned back to me, her expression more serious than I'd ever seen it. Will you help me figure out what comes next? I know I don't deserve it after years of dismissing your advice, but you don't need to deserve help from family, I said. You just need to be willing to listen this time. For the first time in our adult relationship, Emma was acknowledging that I might have something valuable to offer, not as the disappointing younger brother, but as someone who'd successfully navigated challenges she'd failed to overcome. Practical daughter had finally learned the most practical lesson of all. Sometimes the best strategy is admitting you don't have all the answers. The The old family videos played on my parents' television, grainy footage from birthdays and holidays that told a story they'd never bothered to notice. 8-year-old Michael sharing his Halloween candy with his siblings. 10-year-old Michael helping his grandmother with her groceries. 12-year-old Michael tutoring a struggling classmate in math. I never realized, Mom said softly, watching as my younger self gave up his spot in line at an amusement park so a smaller child could ride with his family. You were always like this, weren't you? Always putting others first. Dad was studying the footage with the same intensity he'd once brought to business contracts. Look at this one, he said, pointing to a scene from my high school graduation party. While Jake and Emma were posing for photos and enjoying the attention, I was in the background helping the caterers clean up. We missed it, Mom continued, her voice thick with regret. We were so focused on Jake's achievements and Emma's ambitions that we never saw what was right in front of us. The videos revealed a pattern that had been invisible to them at the time, but was unmistakable in retrospect. While my siblings had been the stars of every family event, I'd been the one making sure everything ran smoothly. The reliable one, the helpful one, the one who put family needs ahead of personal recognition. Remember when Jake was applying to college? Dad asked, freezing the video on a scene from my junior year of high school. You spent hours helping him with his essays, reviewing his applications, even driving him to campus visits. In the video, 17-year-old Michael was at the kitchen table with Jake, explaining the finer points of essay structure while Jake argued about having to follow conventional formats. I had been patient, encouraging, completely focused on helping my brother succeed. Evan, as my own college applications, sat ignored. We assumed you didn't need the same level of support, Mom said. You seemed so independent, so capable of handling things on your own. I was capable of handling things, I said from my spot on the couch, but that didn't mean I wouldn't have appreciated recognition for it, or that I didn't deserve the same level of investment in my future. The next video was from Emma's Sweet 16 party, an elaborate celebration that had consumed weeks of family planning and thousands of dollars in expenses. In the background of the party footage, 15-year-old Michael was managing the music, coordinating with photographers, and making sure Emma's friends were having a good time. You planned half of that party, Dad said, realization dawning in his voice. The playlist, the timeline, even the backup plans for bad weather. We gave Emma all the credit, but you did most of the work. Because you asked me to, I replied. Because you knew I'd handle it responsibly and make sure everything went smoothly. But when people complimented the party, you thanked Emma for her vision and leadership. The pattern continued through video after video. My high school wrestling matches, where I'd competed with dedication but minimal family attendance because Jake's soccer games were considered more important. My graduation from basic training, where I'd earned honor graduate recognition but the family celebration was subdued compared to Jake's college graduation party. My promotion ceremonies in the military, which had been acknowledged with brief phone calls while Emma's business launches received elaborate family support. We took you for granted, Mom said, tears streaming down her face. We assumed your strength meant you didn't need our encouragement, that your reliability meant you didn't deserve special recognition. Dad was shaking his head slowly. We treated your best qualities as if they were automatic, as if they didn't represent choices you were making every day to put family first. The most telling video was from my farewell party before my first deployment. The gathering had been small, subdued, with an undercurrent of worry about my safety but no sense of pride in my service. In contrast, Jake's going-away party for his semester abroad had been a celebration, filled with excitement about his adventures and confidence in his success. Look at your face, Mom said, pointing to the screen. You're smiling, but your eyes are sad. We were treating your deployment like a family tragedy, instead of recognizing the courage it took to serve your country. You were proud of Jake for studying in London for 4 months, I said. But you couldn't find pride in my 3 deployments to combat zones. You saw only the danger and inconvenience, never the honor and sacrifice. Dad paused the video on my face during that farewell party, young, determined, but clearly hurt by the family's lukewarm response to my service commitment. We failed you, he said simply. Not just during your military service, but long before. That we failed to see who you really were. Who was I asked, genuinely curious about their perspective. You were the son who never needed to be asked twice to help, Mom said. The one who remembered everyone's birthdays, who called to check on your grandmother, who worked extra hours to help pay for family vacations. You were the one we could always count on. But we never told you that, Dad added. We never acknowledged that your reliability was a gift to this family, that your selflessness was something to be celebrated, not taken for granted. The video moved to my homecoming from my second deployment, where I'd returned with a slight limp from my injury, but insisted I was fine. The family's relief was obvious, but so was their eagerness to move past the military experience and get me focused on civilian life. We should have asked about your injury, Mom said, watching as I downplayed my limp in the footage. We should have wanted to know what happened, how you were decorated, what your service meant to you. You should have understood that my military service was the most important thing I'd ever done, I said. Not a detour from my real life, but the foundation of everything I became. Dad was studying my face in the homecoming video, seeing for the first time the disconnect between my forced smile and my obvious disappointment in their reaction. You needed us to be proud of you, and instead we were just relieved to have you back safely. I needed you to see that I'd become a leader, that I'd earned the respect of my fellow soldiers, that I'd found my purpose in service, I said. Instead, you saw only the risks I'd taken and the time I'd lost from building a conventional career. The video continued to my transition to civilian life, showing family dinners where I'd tried to share stories from my deployments while the conversation invariably shifted to Jake's job prospects or Emma's business plans. My military experiences were treated as interesting anecdotes rather than formative experiences that had shaped my character. We were so wrong, Mom said, her voice breaking, about everything, about what success looks like, about what really matters, about which of our children was actually building something meaningful. You weren't wrong about wanting success for your children, I said. You were wrong about how you measured it. You valued potential over performance, ambition over achievement, flash over substance. Dad turned off the video player and sat back in his chair, looking older than I'd ever seen him. The son we should have been bragging about to our friends, the one whose achievements we should have displayed prominently, the one whose judgment we should have trusted. We treated him like an afterthought, while the children whose failures nearly destroyed this family were the ones we celebrated and enabled. Mom added. The awakening was painful but complete. For the first time, my parents were seeing the family dynamics clearly, understanding how their favoritism had damaged not just me, but Jake and Emma as well. Their misplaced pride had enabled poor decision-making, while their benign neglect had discouraged the very qualities that were now saving them. Can you forgive us? Mom asked, her voice barely a whisper. I already have, I said. But forgiveness doesn't erase the past. It just allows us to build a different future. Dad looked around the living room that I was about to save from foreclosure, the house that would remain in the family only because of the military benefits they'd never valued. What kind of future do you want to build? One where we're honest about each other's strengths and weaknesses, I said. One where achievements are recognized regardless of who accomplishes them. One where family support isn't based on favoritism or assumptions about who deserves attention. I stood up, feeling the weight of this conversation settling into something permanent. The videos don't lie. I've been reliable, selfless, and committed to this family for 34 years. Now I need you to be the parents who recognize and value those qualities. They nodded, understanding that their awakening was just the beginning of rebuilding relationships that had been damaged by years of misplaced priorities and missed opportunities. The videos had shown them who I'd always been. Now they needed to learn who I'd become. The approved loan documents sat on the kitchen table like a golden ticket, their official seals and signatures representing the difference between salvation and disaster for my family. 18 pages of legal documentation that transformed my military service from an abstract concept into tangible financial power. I can't believe it went through so quickly, Mom said, touching the papers with reverence. 3 weeks from application to approval, VA loans are streamlined for qualified veterans, I explained, organizing the documents into neat stacks. The government guarantee reduces the lender's risk, which speeds up the approval process and eliminates most of the bureaucratic obstacles that stopped your traditional loan applications. Dad was studying the loan terms with his businessman's eye, comparing them to the rejections they'd received from conventional lenders. The interest rate is better than anything we qualified for, even before our credit problems. And no down payment required. That's the power of veteran benefits, I said, unable to keep the satisfaction out of my voice. The same benefits you called government handouts, just saved your house. The loan officer, Sarah Martinez, had been a pleasure to work with herself, a veteran who understood the unique advantages of VA financing. She'd expedited the application, coordinated with the sellers, and ensured that we could close before the foreclosure auction date. Your brother has an impressive credit profile, Sarah had told my parents during our final meeting. Military service creates disciplined financial habits. Veterans tend to be our most reliable borrowers. The comment had hit home with my family, who were finally understanding that my conservative approach to money management wasn't evidence of limited ambition. It was evidence of the financial discipline that made me an attractive borrower when they couldn't qualify for any loans at all. Emma had attended the closing, watching in amazement as I navigated the complex paperwork with ease. You understand all of this, she'd said, watching me review mortgage terms and insurance requirements. The legal language, the financial calculations, the inspection reports are like fluent in this stuff. Military leadership requires understanding complex systems, I'd replied. Logistics, legal frameworks, risk assessment, it's all transferable to civilian situations. Jake had been notably absent from the closing, unable to face the reality that his younger brother was solving the problem he'd created. His absence spoke volumes about his struggle to accept the new family dynamics, where competence mattered more than credentials. The most satisfying moment had come when the loan officer had handed me the keys to the house, officially transferring ownership from my parents to me. For a brief instant, I'd been the sole owner of the family home, holding in my hands the power to make or break their future. These belong to you now, Sarah had said, placing the keys in my palm. Congratulations on your new home. My parents had watched this exchange with a mixture of gratitude and bewilderment. Their youngest son, the one whose potential they'd questioned for decades, was now their landlord. The child who'd been dismissed as unambitious was now making decisions about their living situation, but I'd immediately handed the keys back to Dad, along with a lease agreement that protected both our interests. Welcome to your new rental home, I'd said. Same house, different ownership structure, much better terms than foreclosure. The lease agreement was generous but clear. Rent would cover the mortgage, taxes, and insurance, with a small buffer for maintenance expenses. They could live in the house indefinitely as long as they met their obligations. Major decisions about the property would require my approval, but day-to-day living would remain unchanged. You're really doing this, Mom had said, signing the lease with shaking hands. You're really saving our home. I'm really using my military benefits to help my family, I'd corrected. The same benefits that everyone said I should be grateful for, even though they never understood what they meant. The paperwork complete, we'd driven back to the house together, my house now. Though they'd continue living in it, the foreclosure notice had been replaced with loan documents that secured their future, and the weight of impending homelessness had been lifted from their shoulders. I need to make some calls, Dad had said once we were back in the kitchen. Let people know that we're not losing the house after all. What are you going to tell them? I'd asked. Dad had looked at me with something approaching wonder. I'm going to tell them that my son saved our home. My son who served 3 tours overseas, who earned a Purple Heart, who learned financial discipline in the military, and who had resources we never appreciated. It was the first time I'd ever heard him describe my military service with pride rather than resignation. The first time he'd connected my veteran benefits to positive outcomes rather than treating them as consolation prizes. I'm going to tell them that we were wrong about what success looks like, Mom had added, that we spent so many years focused on the wrong child's achievements that we missed the real success story happening right in our family. The loan approval had been more than a financial transaction, it had been validation of everything. I'd tried to tell them about the value of military service, the importance of conservative financial planning, and the strength that comes from reliable character rather than flashy ambition. Emma had stayed after my parents left, helping me organize the mountain of paperwork that comes with home purchases. I owe you an apology, she'd said while filing insurance documents. Not just for this crisis, but for years of dismissing your approach to life. You don't owe me an apology, I'd replied. You owe yourself an honest assessment of what actually works versus what sounds impressive. Your way works, she'd said simply. Steady progress. Conservative planning. Building on solid foundations. It's not exciting, but it's effective. The military taught me that effective is more important than exciting, I'd said. Exciting gets people killed. Effective gets them home safely. As the sun set on our closing day, I'd stood in the living room of the house I now owned, looking at the family photos that told the story of our complicated relationships, the same room where Jake's diploma hung prominently, where my military service had been politely ignored, where family decisions had been made without valuing my input. Now, it was my house, my decision-making authority, my veteran benefits that had made it possible. The family dynamics had shifted permanently, and everyone was still adjusting to the new reality. The loan documents in my filing cabinet represented more than a successful real estate transaction. They represented the moment when my family finally understood that the son they'd underestimated had become the one they'd all depend on. Military service had prepared me for this responsibility, just as it had prepared me for every other challenge I'd faced. The difference was that now, finally, my family was beginning to understand what that preparation was worth. The new family photo sat on the mantel where Jake's diploma used to hang, showing all of us together at the housewarming party to commemorate not losing our home. But unlike the stiff, formal portraits of previous years, this picture captured something genuine: relief, gratitude, and a grudging respect that hadn't existed before. In the photo, I'm standing in the center for the first time in family memory, flanked by parents who are looking at me with something approaching awe. Jake and Emma are there too, but they're no longer the automatic focus of family attention. The positioning wasn't accidental, it reflected the new reality of who held decision-making power in this family. It's strange having you as the landlord, Mom said, setting down her coffee cup in the kitchen that was technically mine now. Not bad, strange, just ... different. We're still getting used to asking permission for things that used to be automatic decisions. The adjustment had been awkward for everyone. Simple decisions about home improvements or maintenance now required consultation with me, forcing my parents to acknowledge that their decision-making autonomy had been compromised by their financial crisis and restored only through my intervention. You don't need permission to live your lives, I'd assured them. You just need to coordinate with me on major decisions that affect the property or the finances. Dad had struggled the most with the new dynamic. It feels backwards, he'd admitted. Parents are supposed to be the ones helping their children with housing, not the other way around. Maybe that's true in traditional families, I'd replied, but this family has been non-traditional for a long time. We're just acknowledging it now. The change was most obvious during family dinners, which now took place at my house rather than rotating between locations. As the homeowner, I'd naturally become the host, setting the agenda for family gatherings and mediating disputes that arose. Michael, what do you think about Jake's new job prospect? Mom had asked during last Sunday's dinner, automatically deferring to my judgment in a way that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. Jake had shifted uncomfortably at the question. His opinions, once received as gospel, were now just one voice among several. Meanwhile, my assessments carried weight they'd never had before, based on the family's new understanding of my judgment's reliability. It sounds like a good opportunity for rebuilding his career, I'd said diplomatically. Conservative approach, steady income, opportunity to demonstrate reliability. Exactly what his situation requires. The response had pleased everyone except Jake, who was still adjusting to his reduced status within the family hierarchy. The golden child was learning what it felt like to be the family project rather than the family star. Emma had adapted more gracefully to the changed dynamics. I've been thinking about what you said about getting a regular job, she'd told me. Privately, there's a marketing position at a nonprofit that sounds interesting. Stable organization, good mission, opportunity to use my creativity within established systems. That sounds perfect for you. I'd encourage you get to innovate without having to build the infrastructure to support innovation. It pays about half what I used to make when my businesses were successful, she'd said. But it pays twice what I'm making now, which is nothing. The conversation reflected Emma's growing acceptance of reality-based planning rather than wishful thinking. She was learning to measure success by sustainability rather than potential, by actual results rather than ambitious projections. The most significant change was in how the family handled financial decisions. Where once Jake's investment advice had been sought and followed, now all financial discussions came through me. Not because I'd demanded that authority, but because everyone had learned the hard way that my conservative approach produced better outcomes. We're thinking about replacing the water heater, Dad had said during our monthly property review meeting. A formal process I'd instituted to ensure proper maintenance of my investment. The current one is 12 years old and starting to show signs of wear. Get 3 estimates, I'd replied. Compare warranties and energy efficiency ratings. We'll go with the option that provides the best long-term value, not necessarily the cheapest upfront cost. The approach was methodical, thorough, and focused on long-term outcomes rather than short-term savings. Exactly the kind of planning that had made me successful while my siblings struggled with impulsive decision-making. Jake had watched these interactions with a mixture of respect and resentment. You've really thought this through, he'd said after one particularly detailed discussion about property insurance options. The systematic approach, the long-term planning, the risk management, it's impressive. It's military training applied to civilian problems, I'd replied. Same skills, different context. I never understood that before, Jake had admitted. I thought military skills were only useful in military situations. I didn't realize how much the leadership training and strategic thinking would transfer to everything else. The admission was significant because it represented Jake's first genuine recognition of my military service's value. Not grudging acknowledgement forced by circumstances, but actual understanding of the skills I'd developed, and their broad applicability. Emma had been even more direct in her reassessment. I used to think you were playing it safe because you lacked ambition, she'd said. Now I realize you were building systematically because you understood something I didn't. That sustainable success requires solid foundations. Ambition without foundation is just fantasy, I'd replied. The military taught me to build from the ground up, to secure each level before moving to the next one. While I was trying to skip steps and build castles in the air, Emma had said ruefully, the new family dynamics weren't just about financial authority, they reflected a fundamental shift in how everyone understood success, competence, and leadership. The child who'd been dismissed as unambitious was now recognized as the most successful family member. The son whose career choices had been questioned was now the one whose judgment everyone trusted. But the change that meant the most to me was in daily interactions. When I shared stories from work, people listened. When I offered advice, it was considered seriously. When I expressed opinions, they carried weight proportional to my demonstrated competence rather than being dismissed due to outdated family assumptions. You know, Mom had said while we were reviewing the lease renewal, I keep thinking about all the years we spent worrying about your future. Turns out you were building exactly the future this family needed. I was building the future I needed. I'd corrected. The fact that it also saved the family was a bonus. The distinction was important because it reflected my own growth. I was no longer the insecure young man desperate for family approval. I'd found my identity and confidence through military service. And while I was willing to help my family, I no longer needed their validation to feel successful. The new family photo on the mantel captured this transformation perfectly. For the first time, I looked comfortable being the center of attention, confident in my role as family leader, secure in the knowledge that my choices had proven their worth. The family that had emerged from our financial crisis was healthier, more honest, and more functional than the one that had created it. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I truly belonged in it. The thank you cards from fellow veterans covered my desk at the VA office, each one representing a success story that had grown from the confidence I'd gained through saving my own family. Letters from veterans who'd secured their own home loans, started successful businesses, or simply learned to value their service in ways their families never had. Your presentation last month changed my life, read one card from a recently discharged Marine. I never understood how valuable my military experience was until I heard you explain it. Now I'm using my GI Bill benefits and my leadership training to build something real. The veteran workshops I'd started hosting had grown from a small idea into a movement, connecting returning soldiers with the resources and confidence they needed to succeed in civilian life. The same systematic approach I'd used to save my family's house was now helping hundreds of other veterans navigate their own transitions. Michael, there's another reporter on line 3, my assistant called out. Something about a feature story on veteran success programs. The media attention had been unexpected but welcome. My story, military benefits, saving a family from foreclosure, had resonated with people across the country who were dealing with their own financial crises or family misunderstandings about military service. The thing that strikes me, the reporter had said during our interview, is how your family's crisis became an opportunity for broader impact. You could have just saved the house and moved on, but instead you've created this whole support network for other veterans. Military service teaches you that individual success isn't meaningful unless it contributes to mission success. I'd explained. Helping other veterans succeed is just an extension of the same values that motivated my military service. The workshop program had started simply enough. I'd mentioned to a few colleagues that I was planning to share my experience with using VA benefits effectively, expecting maybe a dozen attendees. Instead, we'd filled a conference room with 50 veterans, all eager to understand how to maximize the resources they'd earned through service. The key insight, I'd told that first group, is understanding that your military experience isn't a liability to overcome, it's an asset to leverage. Leadership training, crisis management, systematic thinking, operational planning, these are exactly the skills that civilian employers and lenders value most. One veteran in the audience had raised his hand. But my family keeps telling me I need to move past my military experience, that it's holding me back from adapting to civilian life. Your family probably doesn't understand what military service actually develops, I'd replied. They see only the surface differences: military culture, deployment schedules, dangerous assignments, without recognizing the fundamental capabilities you've developed. The conversation had led to a broader discussion about family dynamics, and the challenge of gaining respect for military service from people who'd never experienced it themselves. Nearly every veteran in the room had similar stories of family members who didn't understand or value their service. Here's what I learned, I'd continued. You can't argue your way to respect. You can't convince people through explanations or emotional appeals. You have to demonstrate value through results. That principle had become central to the workshop curriculum. We focused on practical applications of military skills, concrete ways to translate service experience into civilian success, and strategies for building the kind of track record that forced recognition from skeptical family members. 6 months later, the results spoke for themselves. Veterans from our workshops were getting promoted faster, starting successful businesses, buying homes, and building financial security. More importantly, they were gaining confidence in their own worth and demanding appropriate respect from their families and communities. My brother used to call me crazy for enlisting, one veteran had written in his thank you card. Last week he asked me for business advice. Turns out 4 years of Army logistics training was better preparation for entrepreneurship than his MBA. The stories were remarkably similar to my own experience. Families who dismissed military service as a waste of potential were discovering that their veteran family members possessed exactly the skills needed to solve complex problems and build sustainable success. Emma had become one of my most effective advocates in spreading awareness about the program. I spent years dismissing my brother's military experience, she'd told a group of military family members. I thought it was irrelevant to civilian success. I was completely wrong. The skills he developed in the military are exactly what saved our family and are now helping hundreds of other families. Her perspective as a former skeptic gave her credibility with other family members who struggled to understand their veterans' experiences. She'd started speaking at family readiness groups, sharing her story about learning to value military service and encouraging other families to examine their own assumptions. The biggest mistake we made, Emma would tell these groups, was treating military service like a detour from real life, instead of recognizing it as preparation for real life. My brother's deployments weren't time lost, they were leadership development that couldn't be replicated in any civilian environment. Jake had taken longer to come around, but his transformation had been even more dramatic. His finance background, combined with his new understanding of military value, had led him to specialize in helping veterans with investment planning and business development. I used to think veterans needed to be taught civilian business skills, Jake had told me during our last family dinner. Now I realize civilians need to learn military discipline and systematic thinking. Veterans already have the hard skills, they just need help translating them into civilian contexts. His new career focus was thriving precisely because he understood both sides of the equation. He could speak the language of traditional business while respecting and leveraging military experience. His client base was growing rapidly as word spread about a financial advisor who actually understood veteran capabilities. "Your brother saved my retirement," one of Jake's clients had told my parents. "I'd been struggling to build wealth for 15 years, taking bad advice from advisors who didn't understand how military discipline could be applied to financial planning. Jake showed me how to use the same systematic approach I'd used in the Navy to build a successful investment strategy." The ripple effects continued expanding. My parents had become vocal advocates for veteran support programs, using their business and social connections to promote veteran hiring and educate other families about military service value. "We spent too many years not understanding what our son had accomplished," Dad would tell other parents. "Don't make the same mistake we did. Military service develops exactly the kind of character and competence that builds successful lives." Mom had gone even further, volunteering with veteran family support groups and sharing our story. As an example of how family crises could become opportunities for growth and understanding, "Our family is stronger now than it was before the crisis," she'd tell other military families, "not because we avoided the problem, but because we learned to value each family member's actual contributions rather than our assumptions about success." The Veteran Workshop program had evolved into something larger than I'd ever imagined. We now offered specialized tracks for different types of veterans: combat veterans, military spouses, Guard and Reserve members, XH, addressing specific challenges and opportunities. The most popular workshop was Translating Military Leadership for Civilian Success, where veterans learned to articulate their military experience in terms that civilian employers and families could understand and value. "Don't say you were just a sergeant," I'd tell workshop participants. "Say you were responsible for managing a team of 12 people, coordinating complex logistics operations, and making decisions under extreme pressure. Those are exactly the skills that civilian employers desperately need." The program had attracted attention from major corporations looking to recruit veteran talent, colleges developing veteran-friendly programs, and government agencies working to improve veteran transitions. What had started as a personal family crisis had become a model for veteran empowerment and family education. "The most important thing I learned," I'd told a congressional subcommittee studying veteran transition issues, "is that veteran success isn't just about individual achievement. It's about changing how society understands and values military service. When families respect veteran contributions, when employers recognize military skills, when communities support veteran initiatives, when we see sustainable success." The thank you cards on my desk represented more than successful program outcomes. They represented a fundamental shift in how veterans and their families understood the value of military service. Each card was evidence that service members didn't need to apologize for their military experience or treat it as something to overcome. They needed to leverage it as their greatest asset. "Your program taught me to stop trying to fit into civilian expectations," one veteran had written. "Instead, I started showing civilians what military excellence looks like." The response has been incredible. "My family finally understands what I accomplished during my service, and my employer is promoting me based on the leadership skills I developed in the Marines." As I read through the latest batch of thank you cards, I realized that my family's financial crisis had been the catalyst for something much more significant than saving a single house. It had forced me to articulate and demonstrate the value of military service in ways that were changing how entire communities understood veteran contributions. The lessons I'd learned through military service: discipline, systematic thinking, mission focus, loyalty to something greater than yourself, weren't just useful for crisis management, they were exactly what families, businesses, and communities needed to build sustainable success. My military service had prepared me not just to save my family, but to help other families discover the same strength and capability in their own veterans. The benefits I'd earned through service weren't just government programs. They were tools for building the kind of life and community that honored the values I'd learned to cherish. The real lesson wasn't that military service had practical value, though it clearly did. The real lesson was that service itself, putting the needs of others ahead of your own, committing to something greater than personal advancement, maintaining loyalty even when it's not reciprocated. These values created the foundation for every other form of success. My family had learned that lesson the hard way. Now I was helping other families learn it before crisis forced recognition they should have offered freely. The new house keys glinted in the morning sunlight as the first handed them to the Rodriguez family, another veteran household saved from foreclosure through the program we'd developed. Their situation had been remarkably similar to my family's financial crisis. Family skepticism about military benefits, and the discovery that veteran resources could provide solutions unavailable to civilian borrowers. "I can't believe this," Israel, Maria Rodriguez said, clutching the keys to their new home. 6 months ago, we were facing bankruptcy. Now we own a house again, and my husband's military service is finally being recognized for what it's worth. Sergeant Rodriguez nodded, his pride evident as he looked at the modest but well-maintained house that would be his family's fresh start. My wife's parents used to ask when I was going to get a real job after the Army. Last week, they asked me to help their neighbor who's also a veteran and facing foreclosure. Funny how perspectives change when they see results. The transformation was becoming routine, but it never stopped being satisfying. Families who'd dismissed military service as a liability were discovering it could be their salvation. Veterans who'd been made to feel apologetic about their service were learning to leverage it as their greatest asset. How many families have you helped now? Maria asked as we walked through their new home. Direct assistance. About 40 families, I replied, but the workshop graduates have helped hundreds more. The ripple effects keep expanding. The program had grown beyond anything I'd originally envisioned. What started as personal crisis management had evolved into a comprehensive support network that connected veterans with resources, families with education, and communities with opportunities to honor service. Appropriately, my own family had become the program's most compelling testimonial. The house that had nearly been lost to foreclosure was now a gathering place for veteran families, a symbol of what was possible when military benefits were understood and applied effectively. Tell me again about your brother and sister, Sergeant, Rodriguez said. The ones who used to criticize your military service. They are now 2 of our most effective advocates, I said with a smile. Jake specializes in veteran financial planning, and Emma speaks to military families about understanding their veterans' experience. They've completely reversed their perspective on military value. What changed their minds? Reality, I said simply. When their own approaches failed and military-trained problem-solving saved the family, they had to acknowledge what actually worked versus what sounded impressive. The Rodriguez family was moving in during the same week that marked the 2nd anniversary of my family's crisis. The difference between then and now was extraordinary not just in circumstances, but in relationships, understanding, and mutual respect. My parents had planned a celebration dinner for the anniversary, wanting to mark the transformation of our family dynamics. It's not really about the house, Mom had explained when she'd called to coordinate the gathering. It's about recognizing how much we've all grown and learned. What specifically are we celebrating? I'd asked. Honesty, she'd replied. For the first time in decades, our family relationships are based on who we actually are, rather than who we thought we should be. The celebration dinner was held at the house I now owned, but they continued to live in a arrangement that had worked better than anyone had expected. The physical structure was the same, but the family that gathered there was fundamentally different from the one that had faced foreclosure 2 years earlier. Jake arrived first, bringing financial statements that showed the success of his veteran-focused practice. I've got news, he announced. The firm is promoting me to partner, specifically because of the Veteran Services division I've developed. They want to expand the program statewide. Emma came in shortly after, carrying a folder of materials from her latest speaking engagement. I addressed a conference of military family readiness groups last week, she said, standing ovation. Apparently, my perspective as a reformed skeptic really resonates with families who are struggling to understand their veterans' experience. The contrast with family dinners from 2 years earlier was stark. Instead of Jake and Emma dominating conversation with their ambitious plans, the focus was on collaborative achievements that built on each family member's actual strengths. Michael, show them the letter from the VA secretary, Mom said, her voice glowing with pride. I pulled out the official correspondence that had arrived that morning, recognizing our veteran transition program as a national model and requesting a presentation to senior VA leadership. They want to implement our approach system-wide, explained apparently. Our combination of practical assistance and family education is producing better outcomes than traditional programs. Dad raised his glass in a toast, to the son whose judgment we should have trusted from the beginning, whose service we should have valued more highly, and whose character we should have recognized sooner. To the family that learned to see each other clearly, I replied, raising my own glass. Not the family we thought we should be, but the family we actually are. The toast was interrupted by my phone ringing, another veteran family facing crisis. Another opportunity to apply the lessons we'd learned. The calls came, regularly now, referred by VA counselors, veteran service organizations, and families who'd heard our story. Michael Carter, I answered. Sir, this is Staff Sergeant Williams. I got your number from the VA. My family's about to lose our house, and I heard you might be able to help. I looked around the table at my family parents, who now understood the value of my service, siblings who'd learned to respect military-trained capabilities, all of us gathered in the house that had been saved by the benefits they'd once dismissed. I can definitely help, I told Staff Sergeant Williams. When can you come in for a consultation? As I scheduled the appointment, I realized that my family's crisis had been the catalyst for discovering my true calling, not just saving our house, but creating a model for how veteran families could support each other. how military service could be properly valued, and how individual success could contribute to community strength. The keys I'd handed to the Rodriguez family that morning represented more than another successful home purchase. They represented the continuing expansion of a movement that honored military service, supported veteran families, and demonstrated that the skills developed through military service were exactly what civilian communities needed. 2 years earlier, my family had said I'd wasted my life in service. Now they understood that my service had prepared me for exactly the challenges they'd needed me to solve. The benefits they'd called handouts had become the foundation for a program that was changing how thousands of families understood military value. Looking around the dinner table at my transformed family, I understood that the greatest victory wasn't saving the house or building a successful program. The greatest victory was finally being seen and valued for who I actually was, rather than being dismissed for who they'd thought I should be. My military service hadn't been a waste of potential. It had been preparation for the most important mission of my life, proving that service creates value that extends far beyond the individual who serves. The house was safe, the family was stronger, and the program was growing. But more than that, the values I'd learned through military service, loyalty, discipline, service to others, and commitment to mission success had become the foundation for everything meaningful in my civilian life. They'd said I wasted my life in service. Instead, service had taught me how to build a life worth living.